Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This story begins about 400 years ago. A group of people who just wanted to practice their religion and live their lives in peace, without a tyrannical ruler overseeing every aspect of their lives. And remember, they were good people, really good people. They did not want war and death and fighting at this point. They just wanted to be left alone. So being such a good-natured people, they looked for a solution that didn't involve violence. And this was chance number one given to the tyrants. So when an opportunity showed itself, these good people decided to, instead of fighting another war and losing thousands to a destructive, miserable, untimely death, that they would instead risk only their own lives and deaths and take the 6-month or more very dangerous trip across the Atlantic. When these good people finally found their way to this new land, they began to build a new life for themselves, free from the control of these tyrannical monarchies. But it didn't last long. The never-ending quest for control, and of course the inherent greed associated with any and all monarchs, led to the monarchy once again forcing itself upon the people. And after a short 100 years or so, which isn't that long back then, when everything including information moved at a snail's pace, these tyrants were back at the throats of these good people. So they thought that, especially considering the great distance this new land was from the seat of the British Empire, that maybe diplomacy would work. And this was chance number two given to the tyrants by these good people. So they set up the Continental Congress of 1765 in order to attempt to resolve this peacefully. The Continental Congress of 1765 was a meeting held in New York, consisting of representatives from some of the British colonies in North America. It was the first gathering of elected representatives from several of the American colonies to devise a unified protest against new British taxation. And again, this was chance number two given by those good people to those tyrants. But to no avail, as the king went on to implement the Stamp Act upon the necks of the colonies. This act imposed a direct tax on the British colonies in America and required that many printed materials in the colonies be produced on stamped paper produced in London, carrying an embossed revenue stamp. Printed materials included legal documents, magazines, playing cards, newspapers, and many other types of paper used throughout the colonies. And it had to be paid in British currency, not in colonial paper money. This led to protests within the streets of all of the colonies, even those British subjects in Quebec and Canada. This led to the formation of a group known as the Sons of Liberty, of which was the group that was ultimately responsible for the eventual overthrow, the full overthrow of the British monarch control of the colonies through what would become the American Revolution. The Stamp Act was seen as a suppression and censoring tool, very similar to what we are seeing today with the big tech and the main newspapers in this country. Essentially, this act made it so no documents like newspapers, for instance, or books or informational pamphlets, that no documents can be printed for distribution unless they are printed on papers provided for via a fee to the colonies from Britain, or printed on paper that the king forced the colonies to buy from him, in a nutshell. John Adams made the case that this was the king's way of determining the colonies' free or not so free speech, determining what it is that can be printed in newspapers for the consumption of the masses. He argued was the control of information. So the Patriot press fought back. By 1760, the fledgling American newspaper industry comprised 24 weekly papers in major cities. Benjamin Franklin had created an informal network so that each one routinely reprinted news, editorials, letters, and essays from the others, thus helping them form a common American voice. And this was the predecessor to syndication, where radio stations, for instance, pick up a popular station and air it across multiple platforms. It's also eye-opening to know that these patriots understood the power of the media, and it seems as though Ben Franklin understood also well those 4 a.m. talking points. And just thinking out loud, but if these guys understood coordination of the press as they did, almost 250 years ago, then how come it's so hard to believe that some entity is behind the narratives that we see each day by the communist, Satanist-controlled media? All the editors were annoyed at the new stamp tax that they would have to pay on each copy. By informing colonists what the other colonies were saying, the press became a powerful opposition force to the Stamp Act. Many circumvented it, and most equated taxation without representation with despotism and tyranny, thus providing a common rallying cry of protest for the 13 colonies. So then came the Tea Act of 1773. An objective was to undercut the price of illegal tea smuggled into Britain's North American colonies. This was supposed to convince the colonists to purchase company tea on which the townshend duties were paid, thus implicitly agreeing to accept Parliament's right of taxation. Smuggled tea was a large issue for Britain and the East India Company, since approximately 86% of all of the tea in America at the time was smuggled Dutch tea. And quickly, so you understand, the East India Company was the largest company in the world, the most successful and most valuable, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, when adjusted for inflation, the East India Company is still the most profitable and most valuable company to have ever existed. Even bigger than our good buddy Jeff Bezos at Scamazon. Colonists in the 13 colonies recognized the implications of the Act's provisions, and a coalition of merchants, smugglers, and artisans, similar to that which had opposed the Stamp Act in 1765, mobilized opposition to delivery and distribution of the tea. In Boston, this resistance culminated in the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, when colonists, some disguised as Native Americans, boarded tea ships anchored in the British harbor and dumped their tea cargo overboard. Parliamentary reaction to this event included passage of the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts, designed to punish Massachusetts for its resistance, and the appointment of General Thomas Gage as Royal Governor of Massachusetts. And I want to quickly point something out here. One of the things that the Coercive Acts did was ban town meetings in Massachusetts in order to suppress information and suppress any organizing. And today, with this pandemic, what are the entities that are currently shut down by the government? Let's say here in Michigan, where I'm at. Churches, bars, and restaurants. All places that patriots gathered back then, spreading the word. This act led to the British to implement a blockade of Boston Harbor, effectively cutting off all resources and goods coming into Massachusetts, prompting those good people who just wanted to be left alone to create a diplomatic body known as the First Continental Congress in October of 1774. This was chance number 3 given to the tyrant. During the opening weeks of the Congress, the delegates conducted a spirited discussion about how the colonies could collectively respond to the British government's coercive actions, and they worked to make common cause. They ultimately agreed to impose an economic boycott on British trade, and they drew up a petition to the king pleading for redress of their grievances and repeal of the Intolerable Acts. That appeal had no effect, so the colonies convened the Second Continental Congress the following May, shortly after the battles of Lexington and Concord, to organize the defense of the colonies at the outset of the Revolutionary War. The delegates also urged each colony to set up and train its own militia. And ladies and gentlemen, that was the end of the peaceful attempts to resolve this. This taxation without representation, and let me interject here quickly, taxation without representation. This is the act of being taxed by a government that is disconnected from its citizenry, one that uses its citizens' labor, knowledge, and treasure for its own benefit, giving nothing of any real value in return to its subjects, because they are not truly representing them. I'd like to point out that today, especially with the Dominion voting systems and Smartmatic software selecting our leaders for us, along with the bought and paid for politicians, that it seems as though we are experiencing a direct case of taxation without representation today. It's almost as though, as we have seen with the 2020 COVID relief stimulus bill that our representatives seem to care more about non-Americans than they do actual Americans. And this would be a textbook example of taxation without representation. Just as the monarchy of King George and all its laws that it enacted solely benefited England and not the colonies, it seems that all the laws enacted over the last 40 years, along with the narrative coming from the Luciferian media and establishment as a whole, have benefited not Americans, but rather illegal aliens in America. Or our money shipped overseas to help this country or that country. All the while we owe over $25 trillion to the Federal Reserve, of which we can't hardly pay even the interest. While this money going overseas supposedly goes to many different countries, it ultimately is helping one country in the end, and that is China. Yes, China, because when the U.S. crashes, the Chinese have been placed into the position of being the sole economic superpower in the world. This unlimited spending that goes to other countries rather than staying in America to promote programs and infrastructure here, is a big part of the plan. This will bankrupt America, and in fact, all it will take is for the Fed to request its money from us, while at the same time China will begin to sell its treasury notes that it holds. China is the largest holder of U.S. T-bills. I should say when these two events happen, they will be deliberate, they will happen simultaneously, and it would cripple America on the spot, immediately. And all of that interjection is simply to show you how we are living in a textbook example of a taxation without representation state. And I'd like to quote what John Adams said about that. Quote, "If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having a legal representation where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves?" End quote. The Second Continental Congress marks the turning point for the American Patriot. It is at this time that the Patriots understood that this could not be done via diplomacy, and it gave rise to the saying that the tree of liberty needs to be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. And so these actions further raised tensions that led to the eruption of the American War of Independence in April of 1775, because at this time there was no new world, no Americas, nowhere to run to. And this is when good people make unthinkable decisions. The Sons of Liberty mobilized, and this gave rise to many of the heroes that we know of today, like Paul Revere and his Midnight Riders, establishing a network of communication across all the colonies. And oh yes, ladies and gentlemen, this very much was an information war, very similar to what we are experiencing today. And so with a network of patriots spreading the word on the streets, Ben Franklin used his media prowess to incorporate a strategy to cut through the monarchy's disinformation campaign and combat the lies coming from England, allowing for publications like Thomas Paine's Common Sense and many others like it. But it wasn't going to be a war fought only in the mind. It would play out in the middle of the colonial towns and villages, in their backyards, and in the backwoods of this new fledgling nation. This set off the greatest explosion of the love of freedom that the world has ever seen, prompting young men and old to come out from the fields tending their crops and to pick up arms and fight for their freedom and the freedom for their children. It also saw a ragtag group of farmers rise up to engage and ultimately defeat the greatest superpower on earth at that time. Dear listeners, never underestimate a patriot that sees no peaceful way out of a situation. For it is an animal that becomes ferocious if it finds itself backed into a corner. And mark my words, it will fight its way out. And you can take that to a foreign-controlled Federal Reserve Bank, ladies and gentlemen. Through a vast network of midnight riders and small colonial independent media companies, these farmers succeeded in pushing the British out from this new country and established freedom for themselves and their children. But as history has shown, the tyrants kept at it, and we had to resort to death or war many more times throughout the early period of statehood, but also all the way up into modern times too. And this is something that many patriots who would later hit the American scene would warn us all about, including Ronald Reagan. He said this, quote, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it down to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free." End quote. And folks, this is exactly what we are up against today as those anti-freedom tyrants are at it again, this time coming to us in the form of the freedom-hating ideology known as communism. And this attack on our country is ramping up in a very big way. Through control of almost all forms of information dissemination, which includes most all the media, newspapers, big tech, most of the loudest and well-known politicians, all of Hollywood, most TV personalities, and almost all the most popular sports stars, they're shoving a narrative down America's throats telling you it's the majority opinion, and if you don't jump on board, then something is wrong with you. You're a racist, uninformed, a conspiracy theorist. But those powers behind it all have made some fatal calculations, dear listeners. Their ignorance, or maybe it's just arrogance and disrespect, but in any event, their ignorance of the American Patriot's intellect is proving to be a major flaw in their playbook. Patriots are wide awake, and there are many more of us than there were 250 years ago. And folks, this time we are worldwide. We are in America, but also in Australia, Europe, Korea, or the Nordic country, as I see in the subscribership to this channel. Many of us still think the exact same ways as those brave men and women who came before us. While the battlefield is different today, it's still the same. And follow me here. Throughout this current war for our independence, I have had a front row seat. I've watched millions of patriots wake up over the last 4 years, and it's clear that this force will soon be unstoppable. From the millennials to those middle-agers to those senior citizens all waking up, many folks aside from the millennials having no real skills with computers and internet are diving headfirst into this battle and are learning how to fight on this battlefield. I see senior citizens joining Twitter, engaging others with memes and other info. I take myself, having grown up in the 70s and 80s, making videos using basic stock software, attempting to get this info out. I'm so far into the sticks that we don't even have internet provided. I have to use a hotspot, and a 30-minute video literally takes 5 or 6 hours to upload. But we persist. That's what patriots have always done. I watch those who have somehow been able to evade the censoring, push various truths of our government, our country, our leaders out to the masses. You are the modern-day midnight riders, riding across the country, the world, armed not with muskets, but with memes and information, attempting to warn any and everyone of the truth, trying to wake a few people up before it's too late. We're getting close to the finish line, patriots. It is a do-or-die situation right now, and many of you know it. And so I say to you, hold the line. I see shop workers, law enforcement, office workers, and retirees all riding on the front lines every single day. Many of whom had to, just recently, understanding the state we are in, had to teach themselves how to fight in this battlefield of Twitter or Facebook or YouTube. And I know many of you, just like myself, who will be gone from Twitter or Facebook or YouTube as soon as we feel that the Patriots have assumed control and have cleaned this mess up. Just as those farmers and shopkeepers went back into their fields to tend their crops or their shops to sell their goods after the war was over, so will the modern midnight rider. Just as their forefathers did before them. But just like those patriots who fought for independence from that tyrant so long ago, they had to remain vigilant, and they did, as they had to slap that tyrant again about 35 years later in 1812. And so, let this be a warning to us all to remain ever vigilant, as the patriot Ronald Reagan warned. Most of you modern day midnight riders, or I think we could call you all digital soldiers, will return to your jobs and your lives when this is over, but you will keep your eyes open and will return with your memes and your info if the situation arises. I don't know what will happen on January 6th or on the 20th. I'm hoping that the Constitution will be the authority that fixes our dire situation. But we have a large portion of our lawmakers who are agents of the communists, and the same goes for the Supreme Court, so this hope may not ever come to fruition, as our country seems to have been almost totally infiltrated. It seems as though the devil worshippers have a plan for us, one of scorched earth, a civil war, coupled with a financial collapse that will lead to a UN accord that will usher in their authoritarian, socialist, at first, New World Order. But I think that patriots, those good people who just want to be left alone, those people who care about others, are in the midst of their own plan to combat this takeover, and once again, it is the peaceful route, the one with the least amount of death and destruction. And so let's hope that this Patriot plan wins out, as the alternative is unthinkable. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say, God bless the U.S. military, the saviors of mankind. If you enjoyed this quick presentation, please like, share, and subscribe, and please consider supporting this channel on Patreon. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching.